amongst Kurdish and Turkish diasporic communities or Turkish people in Europe. We got several emails from Sweden, from Germany, and even here they ask me why we are organizing at 6, because many of them working, whether possible to do at the weekend or after 8, which is impossible of course for many people. That is what, I mean, we invited many people from many different countries, from Canada, from US, from Sweden. But first time we got really a lot of emails that people say, oh, I know her, I followed her articles, which was for us also surprise, really. Okay, Nicole Pope, she is a Swiss journalist and writer based in Istanbul. She is the author of Honor Killing in the 21st Century, which will be published in January. And also she's co-author of Turkey Unveiled, the history of Turkey, modern Turkey, which will be updated soon with the first editions. Yes? Fourth edition. She worked for 15 years as Turkey correspondent for the French Le Monde newspaper and published articles in international newspapers and different journals. And she currently writing a column for the Turkish today's Zaman. And also she's analyst and independent writers. Yes, thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to meet you all. I'm not an academic, so I'm not very good at making proper formal speeches or reading proper papers, so I prefer to have an interactive discussion. But of course I will first give you a little bit of a framework or try to explain a little bit what is happening right now in Turkey. Of course, these days, Turkey is very much in the news. Internationally, you probably saw that Prime Minister Erdogan made the front page, the cover of Time magazine, which of course caused a lot of pride in Turkey, because this is not something that happens very often. Every time you open an international newspaper these days, especially since these sort of Arab uprisings in the various countries, Turkey's name comes to the fore very often, and usually with a lot of praise and a lot of suggestions that Turkey might be a model or an inspiration for these countries. Now, of course, I personally don't think that Turkey can be a model, an inspiration perhaps, but certainly I think that what is happening and the fact that Turkey is getting so much praise and so much attention right now has to do partly with the changes in Turkey over the past decade, because clearly Turkey has become a much more stable country overall. In spite of a lot of problems that I will be talking about shortly, it has become a more democratic country as well. And of course, economically, it's been growing steadily. It's a much more prosperous country, and generally, you see the difference when you come here and you see that everybody's depressed. You don't get that sense at all in Turkey, where people have really the feeling that things are getting better, and you certainly, from Turkey, you can certainly feel the sort of shift in the world. I mean, the fact that the sort of power centers are moving east, and Turkey is becoming much more vocal and is finding its own feet, as it were, on the international scene. But what is interesting is to see how the Western world is also changing its approach to Turkey, because when the AK Party, the Justice and Development Party, came to power in 2002, at first there was a lot of concern in, perhaps less in Brussels than in the US, where the sort of neocons at the time were quite concerned about having an Islamic, moderately Islamist government. Of course, at the time, no one really knew what Islamist meant in the Turkish context. And there were a lot of concerns that Turkey might suddenly turn into another Iran. And last year, for example, when there was this, when Turkey had this big dispute with Israel over the Mavi Marmara relief ship that was attacked by Israeli forces, and nine Turks, or rather 8 Turks and 1 American were killed. And then Turkey became very vocal against Israel, and of course, again, that caused a lot of concern in Western capitals, and especially in Washington, where, of course, the fact that Turkey was moving away from Israel was a problem, but also, you know, suddenly you had all these anguished articles in the Western media saying, oh, we've lost Turkey, or Turkey's turning its back to the West and turning east and, you know, getting close to Iran and so on. And now fast forward to this year, the sort of post-Arab Spring, or at least, you know, the Arab Spring starts, and suddenly everything is different in the region, and you know, people start getting worried about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and other Muslim groups in the rest of the Arab world. And suddenly, the Turkish model seems very attractive, because, after all, it's still a secular state. It is a democracy. It is a vibrant democracy, a flawed one, but it is nonetheless a democracy. And it is doing well economically, and basically it manages to maintain good ties with the West and be an ally, a NATO member, while at the same time clearly stretching its wings and developing ties with other countries in the region. So it's quite clear that for the West, suddenly Turkey has become a very attractive model. Now, of course, when you look at it from inside Turkey, if you want to be a bit more critical, it seems sometimes that the praise that is heaped on Turkey these days is almost exaggerated, in the sense that Turkey is still undergoing this democratization process. There are still serious flaws that need to be fixed, and of course we have violence has erupted again on the Kurdish conflict, and there's still a lot of issues in terms of freedom of opinion and so on. I'm going to try and give you in spite of these problems, I mean, I'm not disputing that Turkey is, you know, that there's a good reason why Arab countries, or the Arab street, let's say, looks at Turkey with, I mean, they don't necessarily want the model, but they certainly see something that is attractive. It's a country where the government, the civilian government, is now has just about managed to gain control over the army, which of course in countries like Egypt, well, they clearly haven't got there yet. And it's especially the economic model, which is largely a neoliberal model, but the Turks have embraced it with enthusiasm. You know, consumer society is booming in Turkey. But of course the liberalism does not necessarily extend to the politics, and one of the concerns lately has been that the AK party, the ruling party, having just won in June its 3rd mandate with an even bigger majority than before, this time it got like 50% of the vote, which is really quite extraordinary in a country that, you know, in the 1990s, it had a series of very short-lived coalition government that could achieve absolutely nothing. And now you have a government that's been in power for nearly a decade and is still going strong and stronger. But of course, the problem is that when you have a party that is that strong, and an opposition that is extremely weak, then you don't have the checks and balances. And the Prime Minister is both an extremely colorful personality, a great orator, a very, very charismatic politician, and someone with a real sense of timing and, you know, real politician. But at the same time, he also has a short fuse, is constantly angry, is very, you know, he has his outbursts, and he's quite illiberal, he's quite authoritarian. And of course that causes a lot of concern in many quarters. And of course the laws, a lot of things have changed, but there are still problems, as I said, with freedom of opinion, for instance. I mean, to give you an idea, I think that there are still like 40 articles in the criminal code that can be used to curb freedom of expression. And unfortunately, they are still used. I think right now there's like 76 journalists who are in jail. I mean, of course, the judiciary would argue that they are terrorists, or, you know, they are in jail for terrorist activities or links with terrorist groups rather than journalism. But certainly one of the biggest issues in Turkey these days is not just the laws themselves, but also the judicial process. I mean, the courts take forever to try cases. It literally takes years. And people are held in detention for, you know, for these lengthy pre-trial periods. I mean, you literally serve your sentence before you've even been convicted, which is obviously of great concern. So you have, you know, all kinds of people who get jailed. You have students who, you know, unfurl a banner asking for free education, and they get thrown in jail. You have, obviously, these days, and I'll get back to it when I talk about the Kurdish issue, a lot of Kurdish politicians and activists. And of course, you've had a wave of arrests in these cases that have actually really turned the tide in Turkey, flawed as they are. The Ergenekon cases and the sledgehammer cases. I mean, there's been a whole series of court cases that, of inquiries that have led to the arrest of literally hundreds of people, but including many high-level military officers who were accused of plotting coups to overthrow the government. Now, there's, you know, at the beginning there's definitely a sense that some of these arrests or some of these inquiries are justified, but then the net was cast ever wider, and there are probably people who were arrested who should not have been arrested and certainly should not be detained before their trial, including, for instance, 2 journalists who were arrested in March and are still in jail, but the charges are not very clear, but they are, you know, they are said to be linked to this Ergenekon terror group, but no one really believes that it's the case. So this clearly the laws that and the judicial process is still a major problem. And the other major issue is again, it's also legislation, but it's again the anti-terror legislation, which was actually amended by this government, and that is also used in a lot of these cases. In the past 2 years, while on the one hand the government was trying to engage in some kind of peace process or opening with the Kurdish Kurdish nationalists or the Kurdish party and the PKK. At the same time, it was arresting large numbers of the people who are said to belong to an organization which is called the Union of Kurdish Communities, which is a kind of umbrella organization linked to the PKK. I think that to date, and this is a figure that I had yesterday, there's currently 4,250 people who have been detained as part of this series of operations, including recently, in the past few days, 40 lawyers of PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan were among the people who were arrested. So obviously when I mention these figures, it doesn't look very promising and it doesn't look like things are very rosy, and they certainly are not in that respect. And yet, I look at it from the perspective of nearly 25 years now, over 20 years in Turkey. And despite these setbacks, and these are clearly setbacks at this point, there is a major change. There are fundamental changes happening in Turkey in spite of all this. Yes, journalists are under pressure. There is some self-censorship at times, and there is obviously some arrests. And yet, when you compare to what it was, say, in the 1990s or in the 1980s when I first arrived, the level of debate has changed tremendously. And I think that we're getting to a point, I mean, it's still difficult to see how it's going to evolve. I mean, the main thing right now that is on the program of the government, and whether they'll be able to do it in such a polarized atmosphere at the moment, is difficult to see. But they want to reform the constitution, completely rewrite the constitution. And they plan to do it by the end of next year. Now, why is that important? Well, the current constitution was introduced in 1982 during the period of military rule. That was just after the military took over, and it was really a constitution written largely by the military. And although there have been a number of amendments, here and there over the years, it's quite clear that the whole constitution needs to be rewritten to completely change some very fundamental notions, such as the definition of Turkish citizenship, because the current constitution, there is the word Turk is both used as defining a Turkish citizen, but also it has an ethnic connotation. And of course, for Kurds are not Turks, they are citizens of Turkey, but they are not ethnic Turks. And so there's clearly a need to redefine the notion of citizenship. And there's also a whole different approach to the state. There was always this idea that the citizen is there to serve the state instead of the reverse. So the judiciary, and I think still today, there's still this notion that somehow the judge's job, the main job, is to protect the state rather than defend the rights of individuals. And again, this has to be enshrined in the rights of individuals have to be enshrined in the constitution. But of course, Turkey is very polarized, and every article that you start debating creates a big debate. And it's actually quite a difficult process in a very polarized atmosphere, but there's also something that is happening right now, and I think that perhaps it's difficult to explain from the outside, but there's so much pain in Turkish history. I mean, obviously, as Kurds, you know about the pain that Kurds have suffered in the past few decades. But the pain of the Kurds is only one of a lot of many dark episodes. And suddenly there's this, you have the Jews who suffered the wealth tax during the Second World War and were totally ruined.